The alarm did not wake me. I was already awake, standing at the viewport of the UEF battlecruiser Ironclad, watching the slow spin of the Vorath flagship through the glass. It was a beautiful ship, I will admit that. Long and silver, shaped like a blade laid flat, with pale lights running along its hull like a string of cold stars. Beautiful, and crammed from bow to stern with weapons pointed in every direction. I had been staring at it for 20 minutes, unable to sleep, when my comms officer, a young man named Owen Carr, knocked twice on the frame of my door and told me the diplomatic dinner was starting in 40 minutes. I put on my dress uniform, navy blue, gold trim at the collar, 4 silver bars on each shoulder. Commander Nora Hale, United Earth Federation, assigned to escort duty for the Peace Summit. That was the official title. In practice, I was the person responsible for making sure that 60 human diplomats did not get shot in their chairs while trying to negotiate a truce with the Vorath Dominion. We had been at a cold standoff with the Vorath for 11 years. 11 years of border skirmishes and resource disputes and tense silences over open comm channels. No formal war, but no real peace either. The summit was supposed to change that. The Vorath had asked for it. That had surprised everyone in the Federation Council, because the Vorath never asked for anything. They took things. Asking was, in their culture, a form of weakness. So when the invitation came in on a clean diplomatic frequency, everyone assumed it was the first real step toward something better. I was less certain. I had read every intelligence report filed about the Vorath in the last 4 years. I knew their history. I knew what they had done to the Preth colonies on the far side of the outer belt, and I knew that the official Vorath record described that campaign as a territorial correction. I knew how many Preth civilians had not survived the correction. The number was not small. But I was not a diplomat, I was an escort. My job was to keep people safe, not to form opinions. The dinner was held in the grand reception hall of the Vorath flagship, which they called the Voice of Dominion. The hall was enormous, with high ceilings that arched upward into shadow, and long tables draped in deep red cloth. The Vorath were already seated when our shuttle docked. There were perhaps 30 of them, all wearing the formal uniform of the Dominion, which consisted of layered silver robes with a narrow black stripe at the hem. They were tall, the Vorath, taller than humans by about half a head, with long fingers and very pale eyes, almost white, set wide in narrow faces. They moved slowly and deliberately, the way very confident people move, as if they have never once in their lives had to hurry. I stood near the door while the diplomats took their seats. Ambassador Carl Weston led the human delegation, a silver-haired man in his 60s with a calm face and steady hands. He had spent 30 years in diplomatic service and had negotiated 2 other interspecies agreements that were still holding. I trusted him the way I trust a good map. Not blindly, but with reason. The Vorath High Emissary sat at the far end of the central table. His name, as far as any human tongue could approximate it, was Soral Veth. He was older than the others, with deep lines carved into his face and eyes that had not changed expression once since we boarded. He watched the humans settle into their chairs with the quiet attention of someone watching an animal enter a cage. The meal was strange. Vorath food was served in small portions on wide, flat plates, and most of it had no smell at all, which I found unsettling. Food should smell like something. Human dishes had been brought aboard separately, and the contrast was sharp. The smell of warm bread and roasted vegetables spread slowly through the hall, and I noticed several Vorath glance at it with what I could only describe as mild distaste. Ambassador Weston was speaking. He had a gift for making difficult things sound easy, and he was using it now, laying out the broad terms of a potential ceasefire agreement, in language that was simple and direct. Shared trade lanes, neutral zones along the border, a joint commission to resolve disputes before they became incidents. The Vorath listened. They did not respond. Soral Veth turned his pale eyes to Weston and said nothing, and the silence stretched long enough that I counted my own heartbeats. Then, at the 90-minute mark, my earpiece buzzed. It was Owen Carr, still aboard the Ironclad. His voice was very controlled, the way a person's voice gets when they are fighting hard to sound normal. Commander Hale, priority signal from Fleet Command. Kepler's rest colony is dark. All frequencies. Last transmission logged 42 minutes ago. Emergency beacon was activated and went silent 8 minutes later. I stopped breathing for a moment. Kepler's rest. I knew the name. Everyone in the Federation knew the name. It was one of the oldest human settlement colonies outside the core systems. A farming world, mostly. Quiet land and wide fields and a population of just under 40,000 people. Families. Children. Old people who had spent their whole lives watching the same set of moons rise over the same hills. It was the kind of place that appeared on Earth school maps under the heading of Humanity's Future, because it was exactly that. Ordinary and alive, and quietly proving that humans could build something good in the dark between the stars. Define dark, I said quietly, stepping back from the room toward the corridor. No power signatures. No life sign readings from our relay satellite. No response to hailing. The satellite imagery shows... He stopped. I heard him take a breath. Commander, the surface shows thermal scarring consistent with orbital bombardment. Wide pattern. It covers most of the main settlement. I stood in the corridor for 4 seconds. I counted them. 4 seconds of absolute stillness while the information settled into me the way cold water settles into a wound. Then I walked back into the dinner. I did not run. I did not shout. I walked at a normal pace to the head of the table, leaned close to Ambassador Weston, and spoke quietly into his ear. I told him exactly what Owen had told me. I watched the color drain from his face in a slow tide, leaving him pale and very still. He set down his fork with a small, careful sound. At the far end of the table, Sorrel Veth was watching us. His expression had not changed. Not 1 degree. Not one line on that ancient, deliberate face had moved. And in that moment, I understood something that all the intelligence reports and diplomatic briefings in the world had not managed to tell me. The Vorath had not asked for this summit because they wanted peace. They had asked for it because they wanted witnesses. They wanted 60 human diplomats seated at their table, fed on their food, guests in their hall. When the news arrived, they wanted to watch. I straightened up. I looked down the length of the table at Sorrel Veth. I held his gaze for a long moment, and he met it without blinking, without any trace of discomfort. The way a person looks at something they have already decided does not matter. I need to make a call, I said. I said it quietly. I did not perform it. I did not say it for the room. I said it the way you say a thing when it is simply and completely true, when the decision has already been made somewhere beneath the level of thought, in the part of you that is older than language. I turned and walked out of the hall. Behind me, I heard the sound of chairs moving as the human diplomats began to rise. I heard Weston's voice, still steady, still measured, telling the Vorath delegation that the summit was suspended. I heard one of the Vorath say something in their own language. I heard Veth respond, a single short phrase. I did not speak Vorath, but I recognized the tone. It was amusement. I kept walking. In the years since that night, people have asked me what I was feeling when I walked out of that dinner hall. They expect something dramatic, grief, or rage, or a cold resolve that sounds poetic when you describe it later. The honest answer is simpler and harder to explain. I was not feeling anything in the way that word usually means. I was thinking, clearly, precisely, and very fast. I was thinking about the 40,000 people on Kepler's rest, and about the 8 minutes between the emergency beacon activating and going silent, and about what orbital bombardment means for people in the open with no shelter. I was thinking about the children who would have been in school at that hour, and about the fact that Kepler's rest had no military presence, no defense platforms, nothing that anyone could call a strategic target. I was thinking about the Vorath invitation that had brought 60 human diplomats out here, away from home, so carefully timed. And I was thinking about a history lesson that the Vorath should have studied more carefully. I was thinking about the Keth Empire. Everyone in the galaxy knew the name of the Keth Empire, though fewer knew it from history than from rumor. 200 years ago, The Keth had been the largest single political power in the known galaxy. They spanned 43 star systems, maintained the biggest fleet ever assembled by any species, and operated on the unchallenged assumption that no one would ever seriously oppose them. They had looked at humanity, in those early years of interstellar contact, and seen something small, something manageable, something that could be shaped and taxed and, if necessary, removed. They had made that assumption the way the Vorath made assumptions, confidently, completely, without the slightest sense that it might be wrong. The Keth Empire lasted another 11 years after the first time they crossed a human colony line. There was no Keth Empire anymore. There were Keth people, scattered and quiet and deeply committed to a culture of peace, and they were among the most careful and courteous species in the known galaxy. They had learned the way you only learn a lesson that comes at that cost. I reached the shuttle bay, and I opened a direct channel to Fleet Command on Earth. Admiral Paul Drummond answered within 30 seconds. That told me Fleet Command already knew. Paul Drummond was 61 years old, and had commanded more engagements than anyone else alive in the Federation military. He had a face like old stone, and a voice that never rose above a certain level, regardless of what was happening around him. When I told him what I had seen in Soral Veth's expression, he was quiet for a moment. "You're confident it was deliberate," he said. "The timing alone makes it deliberate," I said. "They wanted us seated at their table when the news hit." Another pause. Then, "Come home, Commander. Bring the delegation." "Are we activating Omega?" I asked. Drummond was quiet for 3 more seconds. Then he said, "It was activated 18 minutes ago." I heard that, and something in my chest changed in a way I cannot precisely name. Not relief, not anticipation. Something older and more serious than either. The knowledge that something very large had just begun to move. "Get everyone back to the ironclad," Drummond said. "I'll handle the rest." I closed the channel. I stood in the empty corridor of the Vorath ship, in the humming silver silence of their hall, and I looked out through a porthole at the stars. Somewhere out there, 40,000 people were gone, their fields and their homes and their ordinary lives, erased in the time it took to eat a diplomatic dinner. The Vorath had done it, and they had watched us receive the news from across a table, and they had been amused. I thought about that. I thought about the rule, the oldest rule in known space, the one that predated every treaty and compact and formal agreement, the rule that every species in the galaxy had understood and honored for generations, the one that said you do not touch civilian worlds, you do not target people who cannot fight back, because that is the line, the one line, and crossing it means something permanent and irreversible, and very, very severe. The Vorath had crossed it. They had done it deliberately, with planning and timing, and what they clearly believed was impunity. They had done it because they looked at humanity, and saw something that would absorb the blow, and swallow the grief, and eventually accept the new reality, the way small things accept the shape of the space they are given. I turned and walked back toward the shuttle bay. They had made an error, not a strategic one, though that would become clear soon enough. A deeper error, a fundamental one, the kind you only make when you have studied a species without ever truly understanding them. They had seen our patience and mistaken it for weakness. They had seen our restraint and mistaken it for limitation. They had looked at 40 years of careful diplomacy, and border agreements, and peaceful contact, and they had concluded that we were the kind of creature that would not fight. We were not that kind of creature. We had simply been waiting for a reason to stop being careful. They had just given us one. Fleet Admiral Paul Drummond had been awake for 31 hours when the second wave of confirmations came in, and he did not feel tired. He felt the way he always felt in moments like this, which was precise. Everything unnecessary had burned away. What remained was clear and orderly and exact. The Situation Room at Fleet Command on Earth was underground, beneath the old city of Geneva, in a complex that had been built 2 generations ago for a different kind of war, and repurposed twice since. It was not a dramatic space. Long tables, muted lighting, screens covering 3 walls, and a constant low hum from the climate systems. Drummond stood at the central table with 6 senior officers and 3 civilian advisors, looking at the real-time data coming in from the relay satellite above Kepler's rest. The images were not easy to look at. He looked at them anyway. Looking away was not something he permitted himself. Dr. Grace Ellison, the Federation's chief science analyst, stood to his left and spoke quietly. Thermal pattern is consistent with sustained orbital bombardment from multiple platforms. The spread suggests at least 4 vessels operating simultaneously. Duration approximately 11 minutes. 11 minutes. Drummond filed that away. Any survivors? He asked. The satellite is reading residual heat across approximately 80% of the primary settlement. Thermal signatures consistent with living organisms in the outer agricultural districts. Maybe 300 to 400 individuals. Rescue teams are en route, but won't arrive for 6 hours. 300 to 400, out of 40,000. Drummond looked at the screen for another moment. Then he turned to the tactical panel. Status of War Protocol Omega? Captain Leon Briggs, his tactical officer, answered without looking up from his screen. 18 vessels reactivated and crewed as of 90 minutes ago. Projecting full fleet mobilization of 400 vessels within 36 hours. Deep anchorage sites echo through November, are responding on schedule. First strike group can be jump ready within 22 hours. 400 vessels. Most people outside the military did not know those ships existed. That was intentional. The Federation had maintained a public fleet of 64 vessels, which was more than sufficient for the ordinary business of patrol and escort and border monitoring. The deep anchorage fleet was different. It had been built during the last major crisis, 60 years ago, and then maintained in what the official records described as extended reserve status. In practice, this meant fully fueled, fully armed, crewed by skeleton teams, who rotated through on 8-month assignments, and organized into strike groups with updated tactical software, refreshed every 18 months. The Vorath military intelligence estimated the UEF fleet at 80 vessels. They were going to receive a significant revision of that estimate. Drummond walked to the communications panel. His assistant, a quiet young woman named Hannah Cole, had the compact diplomatic channel open and ready. He picked up the headset. This is Fleet Admiral Paul Drummond, United Earth Federation. I am filing a formal declaration of just cause under Article 7 of the Interspecies Compact, citing the deliberate orbital bombardment of the civilian colony of Kepler's Rest. Classification: non-military. Population 40,000. No defense platforms. No military personnel. No warning issued. The attacking force is identified as Vorath Dominion naval vessels. Declaration timestamp is current. All compact members are hereby notified. He set the headset down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Hannah Cole said, "Signal received and logged by Compact Central. Ambassador-level acknowledgements, incoming from 9 member species." She paused. "There's a message from the Keth Historical Council. It was sent before the declaration, sir. About 6 hours ago." Drummond raised an eyebrow. "What does it say?" Hannah read it. "To the United Earth Federation Command. We do not know what has happened, but we have noted the unusual movement of Vorath vessels in sectors bordering human space over the past 72 hours, and we feel compelled to pass along what our records show. We warned the Vorath High Command 3 weeks ago that provoking humanity would be categorically different from their previous military operations. They did not respond to our warning. We are sorry. We are deeply sorry. Please know that the Keth people stand with you." Signed by Archivist Elder Soen Vel of the Keth Historical Council. Drummond looked at the message for a moment. Then he said, "Send them our thanks, and tell them we'll handle it." He turned back to the tactical display. The deep anchorage sites were lighting up one by one across the map, each one a cluster of vessels, shaking off years of quiet darkness, running their systems up from standby to full operational status. He watched the numbers climb. 40 vessels online. 60. 93. He had served in the Federation military for 38 years. He had been in 2 border engagements and 1 full-scale conflict. The Tesserae incident of 2287, which had lasted 4 months and ended with a treaty that was still holding. He knew what a war felt like from the inside. He knew the weight of it. But this was different. This was not an escalating dispute or a territorial miscalculation that had gotten out of hand. This was a deliberate act, planned and executed and timed, for maximum psychological impact, against people who had no ability to defend themselves, against children. Drummond had a granddaughter named Lily who was 9 years old and lived with her parents in a small apartment in Oslo, and was, by all accounts, the best at drawing horses of anyone in her class. He thought about her for exactly 2 seconds. Then he put that thought in a drawer in the back of his mind and closed it, because the job required him to be clear. "Leon," he said. "Sir, when do we have enough for the first strike group to be credible?" 22 hours to jump capability. Strike Group Alpha can cross the border and reach the first Vorath fleet anchorage in 18 hours after that. Total time from now, 40 hours. Make it 38. Yes, sir. Drummond walked to the far end of the table, where the night-side window looked out over the underground complex. Somewhere above him, Geneva was asleep. The whole planet was asleep, or close to it. Ordinary people in ordinary homes, with no idea that in the deep space above them, the largest military mobilization in Federation history was waking up. He thought about the Vorath High Emissary, sitting at his dinner table, watching Commander Hale receive the news. He thought about what that must have felt like from the Vorath side, a species that measured power in display and dominance, seeing their message land exactly as planned, confident that the human response would be grief and negotiation, and eventually accommodation. He wondered what Soral Veth was thinking right now. He would know soon enough. Back at the communications panel, incoming messages from compact member species were accumulating fast. Most were diplomatic acknowledgments, carefully worded expressions of concern. Some were private channel calls from allied species asking for situation reports. 3 were from species that shared a border with the Vorath Dominion, asking, with varying degrees of subtlety, what they should do. Hannah Cole was handling them with precision and economy. She was 27 years old and had been Drummond's assistant for 14 months. She had never worked during a full-scale war activation before, but looking at her now, you would not know it. She moved from channel to channel with the same focused calm she brought to every task, logging responses, drafting replies, flagging items for Drummond's direct attention. That, Drummond thought, was the thing that people always missed when they tried to understand humanity's military capacity. They looked at ships and weapons and force projections. Those things mattered, but the deeper truth was simpler. It was the people. In a crisis of this magnitude, at 31 hours without sleep, managing communications across 40 active channels while the most serious war activation in a generation unfolded around her, Hannah Cole did not panic. She did not freeze. She worked. The Vorath had a word for humans, in their own language. The closest translation was something like, the soft ones. They used it among themselves as a mild insult, a way of indicating that a species was not to be taken entirely seriously. Soft, breakable, not worth full attention. Drummond had been briefed on this 6 months ago, when the intelligence report first surfaced. He had not been offended. He had filed it carefully, in the part of his mind where he stored information about enemy misunderstandings, because misunderstandings like that were one of the most useful things an enemy could give you. 114 vessels now showing online on the tactical display. He straightened his jacket. He picked up his coffee, which had been cold for an hour, and drank it anyway. Then he went back to work. The Vorath had chosen to cross the one line in the galaxy that everyone who had ever crossed it deeply regretted crossing. He would not waste time being angry about it. Anger was for people who had not yet decided what they were going to do. Drummond had decided. The only thing left now was the doing of it. 3 hours later, a message arrived from the Vorath Dominion on the open diplomatic channel. It was addressed to the Federation Council and to Fleet Command simultaneously, and it requested the immediate resumption of peace negotiations. It described the events at Kepler's Rest as the result of an unauthorized action by elements outside the direct command structure, and offered to provide a formal investigation. It suggested that a return to dialogue was in the interest of both parties. Drummond read it once. He forwarded it to the council with a single line of annotation. The annotation read, "Too late." Then he went back to the mobilization screen and watched number 157 come online. War strategist Velkan of the Vorath Dominion had built his reputation on his models. In 42 years of strategic service, he had never entered an engagement without running full predictive projections first, and in 42 years, those projections had been correct within acceptable margins every single time. He was not proud of this in a boastful way. He was simply accurate about it, the same way he was accurate about everything. It was a professional standard he held himself to. The projections for the human response to Kepler's rest had been among his most detailed. He had run them 17 times, varying the input parameters across all plausible scenarios. The results were consistent. Human initial response, grief, and political outrage. Expected escalation to formal military posture, 3 to 5 months. Given the requirement for political consensus building that their governmental structure demanded. Expected force deployed when full mobilization was achieved, 70 to 90 vessels, based on all available intelligence regarding Federation fleet size. Strategic posture, defensive, oriented toward border security rather than deep strike operations. His counter-strategy was already in place. A visible show of Vorath naval strength along the border would demonstrate the cost of escalation and create pressure for negotiation. The human political class, facing a war they could not win, would return to the table. Kepler's rest would be treated as the price of that education. Harsh, yes, but history was full of harsh lessons, and civilizations that understood power dynamics adapted to them and survived. Velkan was in the tactical command center of the Vorath War Station Pinnacle, orbiting the 4th planet of the Vorath home system, when the first anomaly appeared on his screens. It was a sensor reading from a long-range monitoring post at the edge of human space. His analyst, Sub-Commander Etra, brought it to him quietly, her narrow face arranged in careful neutrality. Strategic Velkan. The long-range array is reading a significant power signature concentration at coordinates matching UEF Deep Anchorage Site Gamma. Velkan looked at the reading. What is the assessed vessel count? We are reading approximately 40 power signatures. She paused. But that is only from the Gamma site. We are also reading signatures from sites identified in our database as uninhabited or decommissioned. How many sites? Etra looked at her screen. 14 currently active. Combined signature count is... She stopped. She rechecked her reading with the careful attention of someone who suspects the equipment might be malfunctioning. How many, Sub-Commander? 163 confirmed signatures. Strategic. And the count is still rising. Velkan was quiet. He looked at the screen. He looked at the numbers. He pulled up his intelligence database and cross-referenced the coordinates with every file his analysts had compiled on the United Earth Federation military in the past 12 years. None of those files mentioned deep anchorage sites. None of them mentioned a reserve fleet. The Federation had 64 vessels on public record. That was the number his models were built on. 64. Continue monitoring, he said. His voice was level. He was a professional. He went back to his office and sat down and began, very quietly, to recalculate. The recalculation took 3 hours, and at the end of it, Velkan sat with the results in front of him and felt something he was not accustomed to feeling. It was not fear exactly. It was the sensation of a model failing, which was in some ways worse, because his models had never failed him before, and the failure of a model you trust is the failure of the floor beneath your feet. He had built his understanding of humanity on 4 decades of observation and analysis. He had studied their history, their conflicts, their political structures. He had noted, correctly, that they were slower to mobilize than most species, that their governmental process required extensive consensus building, that they had maintained a public policy of diplomatic engagement for 40 years. He had interpreted all of this as evidence of a species that had moved past significant military capability, that had chosen trade and expansion over warfare, and that would respond to force with negotiation rather than escalation. He had been looking at the right data. He had drawn the wrong conclusions. They had not moved past military capability. They had stored it, quietly, systematically, across a network of deep space facilities that did not appear on any official registry, maintained and fueled and ready, crewed by personnel who rotated through on assignment schedules that looked, in the surface records Velkan had access to, like routine survey missions. The 40 years of diplomatic engagement was not evidence of limited capability. It was evidence of choice. They had chosen not to use the capability. They had been, in some fundamental sense, waiting. He wondered what for. He suspected he now knew. The first engagement happened 11 days after Kepler's rest, at a Vorath fleet anchorage near the border designation known as Sector 12. Velkan was not present. He monitored from the command station, watching the tactical feed in real time. He had deployed 200 Vorath vessels to Sector 12, more than twice what his intelligence suggested the human strike group could field. His plan was simple and had worked against other adversaries. Overwhelming numerical presence, followed by a demand for withdrawal, followed by negotiation from a position of strength. The human strike group arrived at 1300 hours, station time. They arrived with 112 vessels. Velkan's first thought was that his number was still better. He had 200. They had 112. The math was favorable. He watched his fleet commanders begin the standard approach formation, the broad front spread that maximized weapon coverage and presented the most impressive visual profile, the profile that had made other species recalculate and retreat 17 times in Vorath military history. The human ships did not form a visible pattern. Velkan leaned forward. He studied the tactical feed carefully. The human vessels were moving in what appeared, at first, to be a disorganized spread. No tight formations, no central flagship holding position, no obvious command structure visible in the movement patterns. They were distributing themselves across a vast area, too spread out to support each other, which made no sense. Then they opened fire. All of them, simultaneously, not at the Vorath fleet formation directly, but at specific, precise points. Fuel relay nodes, communication relays. The 4 vessels that Velkan's tactical analysis had identified as the Vorath formation's command ships. Not the center of the formation, the nervous system of it. The Vorath response was immediate and trained. And, he observed with a cold sinking clarity, inadequate. His fleet commanders called for support from their wing formations. The wing formations moved to comply, but the human spread was so wide that engaging one human vessel brought another 2 into range, and the distributed nature of the human force meant there was no single pressure point to concentrate force on. Every time a Vorath formation consolidated, it became a denser target. Every time it spread to counter the human distribution, it lost the mutual support that formations depended on. Velkan called for a tactical withdrawal at 40 minutes. It was not a retreat, he told himself. It was a repositioning. The fleet needed to regroup, to recalibrate. He had not accounted for this pattern of engagement. He would account for it now. He pulled up every tactical database he had on human military history. He had not studied the details of this before, because for 40 years there had been no human military engagements to study. He had 40 years of nothing, and before that, records from the older conflicts, the ones that predated the current era of diplomacy. He read them now. He read about the Tesserae incident, and the Cascades War, and the engagement at the Red Fold, and for the first time in his career, he sat with historical records and felt genuinely uncertain what to do with them. The patterns in those old engagements were consistent with what he had just watched, and with something that his models had no variable for, and that no strategic analysis he had ever encountered had attempted to quantify. The humans in those old battles had not behaved like a species trying to optimize their survival probability. They had behaved like a species trying to hurt something that had hurt them first, and those were not the same objective, and the difference between those two objectives changed everything about how you built a response strategy. A species fighting for survival could be worn down. A species fighting for the dead could not. You could not negotiate with grief the way you could negotiate with fear. You could not threaten a force that had already decided it did not care about the cost. Velkan sat with that thought for a long time. The second engagement was worse. It was 5 days later, and this time Velkan commanded from a forward position, because he needed to see it directly, not through a data feed. He had adjusted his approach. More vessels, better distributed, counter-tactics designed to mirror the human spread. He was ready. The human fleet that arrived was from a completely different strike group, one his intelligence had not known existed. They engaged in coordination with the original strike group, which appeared from the opposite vector simultaneously. 207 human vessels in total, operating across a front so wide that Velkan's entire force was inside it. And the coordination between the two groups was seamless despite the fact that, as far as his signals intelligence could determine, they were operating on minimal communication. No constant command traffic. No central coordination frequency he could identify or disrupt. It was like fighting something with no head. He had expected that the human commanders would make errors under pressure. They did not. He had expected that the distributed formation would create gaps in their mutual support. It did not. He had expected that they would pull back when the cost mounted. They did not pull back. When a human vessel took damage, the others closed around it. Not in a planned way, not in response to any command signal he could intercept. They just did it, as if the need to protect each other was not an instruction but a reflex. That was the moment. Watching that specific thing happen for the 4th time on his tactical display, that Velkan understood the error he had made. He had studied humanity as a political and military institution. He had analyzed their government and their fleet and their resource base and their strategic history. He had done all of this correctly and carefully and professionally. He had not studied what they were. Not at the level that mattered. Not the level beneath all the institutions and structures. The level where a species either breaks under pressure or does not. Where the decision to protect someone next to you becomes something that does not require a reason. He had missed that. He had categorized it as sentiment, and he had treated sentiment as a weakness, and he had been wrong in a way that was becoming very expensive. He drafted a report to Vorath High Command. He used measured language, because that was what he was trained to do. He described the engagements accurately. He gave his assessment of human tactical capacity. He noted the discrepancy between the intelligence estimate of Federation fleet size and the actual fleet size now being observed, which was currently tracking at over 300 vessels active and rising. At the end of the report, in the section reserved for strategic recommendation, he wrote something he had never written before in 42 years of service. He wrote that he did not recommend continued conventional engagement. He wrote that the human force was operating on a motivational basis that could not be countered with superior numbers alone. He wrote that the Vorath High Command should seek immediate diplomatic channels to end the conflict before the operational situation deteriorated further. He sent the report. 6 hours later, Vorath High Command sent an official response. It told him to hold his current position and await reinforcements. Velkan read the response. He read it twice. Then he set it down and looked out the viewport of his flagship at the stars, and he thought about a species that had quietly maintained 400 warships in deep space for 60 years, telling no one, waiting with the patience of something that has no need to prove its strength to anyone. He thought about the dinner table he had never attended, and the 40,000 people on Kepler's Rest, and the human commander who had apparently walked out of the hall without raising her voice. He thought about what that silence meant. And then his proximity alarms went off, and there was no more time for thinking. I arrived above Vorath Prime on the 43rd day of the conflict. The journey from the first engagement at Sector 12 to the Vorath home system had taken 6 weeks of sustained operations, moving strike groups in coordinated sequences across a front that stretched 400 light-years. I will not pretend it was clean. It was not clean. We lost people. I will come back to that. I need to come back to that. Because the numbers are not the story, but the people inside the numbers are. Vorath Prime was visible through the ironclad's forward viewports as a pale blue-green sphere, larger than Earth, wrapped in thin white cloud cover that broke in bands near the equator. From this distance it looked peaceful. Most things do, from enough distance. The orbital defense platforms had been the hardest part of the final approach. There were 41 of them, distributed in an interlocking grid that the Vorath had spent 3 decades building, and which their own doctrine described as impenetrable. It was not impenetrable, as it turned out, because nothing made by anyone ever truly is. But it was serious, and the engagement cost us 11 ships and 468 people getting through it. I know the number because I made myself count. I also know the names. I know that Captain Owen Walsh commanded the 3rd assault vessel to break through the outer ring, and that he did it knowing his ship was critically damaged, and that he held course anyway because the hole he made in the platform grid allowed 12 other vessels to follow. I know that Lieutenant Priya Morton, who had been managing our medical coordination for the entire campaign, was in the secondary command bay of the Steadfast when a platform volley caught us broadside, and that she kept the medical network running for 11 minutes after she should have evacuated, because there were still people in the bay who needed direction. I know that Sergeant Cal Webb, 23 years old, from a small town in the Scottish Highlands, had sent a message to his mother 2 days before the final approach. I read it, because it was passed to me as part of the casualty records. He told her not to worry. I keep all of them in a list, not a database, a list, handwritten, because the weight of a pen on paper is different from the weight of typing, and the difference matters to me. We reached Vorath Prime with 304 vessels still operational. The orbital defense network was down. The Vorath home fleet, what remained of it, had pulled back to a defensive cluster on the far side of the planet. They were not broken, but they were contained. We had orbital dominance, which is a phrase that sounds clean and technical and does not adequately communicate what it means. It means that I could end it. Every flag officer in the strike group knew it. Fleet Admiral Drummond, monitoring from command on Earth, knew it. The Vorath High Command, from the silence of their communications in the hours after we established position, clearly knew it. My tactical officer, Commander Ben Holt, came to me 30 minutes after we achieved stable orbit. He was a careful man, Ben, with a long face and a habit of thinking before he spoke that I had learned to appreciate. He stood in the center of the bridge and he said, "Commander Hale, we have targeting solutions for 93% of Vorath Prime's surface. Authorization codes from Fleet Command are on your console." I looked at my console. The codes were there. A short sequence, clean and simple, the way terrible things often are when you get to the moment of them. I did not touch it. Ben waited. He did not push. That was one of the things I trusted about him. He understood that some decisions need to be held for a moment before they are made. I thought about the 40,000 people on Kepler's Rest. I thought about Owen Walsh and Priya Morton and Cal Webb, and the 468 names I was going to add to my list as soon as this was over. I thought about the Vorath High Emissary sitting at his dinner table, with that expression that had not changed. And I thought about what we were. There is a conversation that happens, in the quiet between crisis and action, about what military force is for. Not the tactical conversation, not the strategic one, the deeper one. The one that asks what the point of winning is, if winning means becoming the thing you were fighting. I had that conversation with myself, standing at my console with the authorization codes 3 inches from my hand. The Vorath had struck 40,000 civilians because they thought it would demonstrate power and produce compliance. They had calculated that the impact of that action would reshape the political landscape in their favor. If I used those codes, I would be doing the same thing, larger in scale, more permanent, and I would spend the rest of my life knowing that I had answered an atrocity with a worse one, and that the 40,000 people on Kepler's Rest had been used, by my own hand, as a reason to do something that no reason could fully justify. I was not willing to do that. I was not willing to be that. I opened a channel to all 304 vessels in the strike group. "This is Commander Hale. Cease fire. I repeat, cease fire. All weapons to standby. Begin coordinated positioning to establish humanitarian corridor to the surface. Medical teams prepare for surface deployment. We are not here to end Vorath Prime. We are here to end the conflict." The silence on the channel lasted about 4 seconds. Then, one by one, I heard the acknowledgements coming in. Vessel after vessel, calm and professional. No one questioned the order. No one asked for clarification. I opened a direct line to Fleet Command. Drummond's face appeared on my screen. He looked like he had aged a week in the past 43 days, which probably meant I did too. He looked at me for a moment, and I looked at him, and the authorization codes sat on my console between us. "You're not going to use them," he said. "No," I said. He looked at me for another second. Then he nodded, once, the way a person nods when they have already considered something and reached the same place you have. "All right, what do you need?" "Emergency relief capacity. As much as you can get moving in the next 12 hours. The Vorath surface population is going to be in significant distress, and I want our first visible action to be medical teams, not anything else." "I'll have it moving in 6 hours," he said. I thanked him. I closed the channel. Then I opened the formal communication link to the Vorath High Command, and I waited. They came on within 40 minutes, which told me they had been watching and waiting to see what I would do with the authorization codes. The officer who appeared on screen was not Soral Veth. It was a younger Vorath, perhaps 60 years old by their scale, with the same pale eyes but a face that was doing something Veths had never done. It was expressing something. Not quite fear, something adjacent to it. The specific expression of someone who has just discovered that the situation is fundamentally different from what they were told. His name, through the translator, was Senior Commander Vale Shan, acting as interim diplomatic contact for Vorath High Command. "We have noted your cessation of offensive operations," he said. "Yes," I said. "We are prepared to discuss terms." "I have terms," I said. "They are not discussion items. They are conditions. You may review them." I transferred the document. It had been drafted by the Federation Council over the past 2 weeks, because they had expected we would reach this point, and they had wanted to be ready. The document was called the Kepler Compact Amendment. It was 41 articles long. It named Kepler's Rest in its preamble. It required full Vorath Dominion acknowledgement of the bombardment as a deliberate act against non-combatants, required the submission of all command personnel responsible to a compact judicial process, required a restructuring of Vorath governance to include external oversight mechanisms for a period of 20 years, required comprehensive reparations to the surviving families of Kepler's Rest, and required the Vorath Dominion to reduce its military capacity to levels consistent with defensive operations only. It was not generous. It was not intended to be. But it was also, I believed, survivable. The Vorath Dominion would not cease to exist. The Vorath people would not be harmed. They would be changed, and constrained, and held accountable. That was different. Vale Shan read the document. He read it slowly. I watched him read. At one point he stopped and looked at me with an expression I could not quite name. "You have stopped," he said. "You could have continued. Our models indicate you had sufficient capacity to—" "I know what we had capacity for," I said. "Then why?" I thought about how to answer that. I had the authorization codes. I had 304 ships. I had every reason, by the logic of force and response and what the Vorath had done to 40,000 people who never had a chance to defend themselves. I had every reason, and I had not used them. "Because we can stop," I said. "Because the ability to stop is something we have and choose to use. That is the answer." He looked at me for a long moment. His pale eyes were doing something I had not seen Vorath eyes do before. They were trying to understand something, genuinely, without the frame of dominance and calculation that governed every Vorath expression I had ever watched. He was looking at me the way a person looks at something they have no prior category for. "Your people," he said, slowly. "We believed we understood your people." "I know," I said. "We did not." "No," I said. "You did not." He looked down at the document. Then he looked back at me. "We will review the terms." "You have 72 hours, I said. I closed the channel. Ben Holt was standing at my shoulder. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I'll get the medical coordination moving." "Thank you, Ben." He turned to go. Then he stopped. "For what it's worth," he said, without turning back around. "I think you made the right call." I did not answer. Not because I disagreed. Because I was already thinking about the next 72 hours. and about the list in my pocket, and about 40,000 names that would have to be there when all of this was finally done. 10 years is long enough for grass to grow back. That is a small thing, but I find myself thinking about it standing here on Kepler's Rest, in the early morning light that comes in long gold angles across the rebuilt settlement, watching the fields move in the wind. Green fields now. Wide and quiet, the way they were before. The memorial is behind me. I come here every year on this date. The stone is black granite, shipped from Earth at the request of the survivors, and the names are cut deep, 40,000 of them, in letters small enough that you have to stand close to read them individually. You could spend a week reading them and still not reach the end. Most people who visit do not try to read them all. They stand in front of the wall, and they look at the names as a mass, as a presence, and they understand something about scale that no number alone can convey. I read them individually, when I come. Every year I read more of them. I am making my way through, slowly, name by name. This year there are more people here than last year. There are always more, year on year, which still surprises me, though I suppose it should not. The story of Kepler's Rest is in the curriculum now, in schools across the Federation, and in several compact member species educational systems, and the young people who learned about it as children are old enough now to make the journey here themselves. I see them in the crowd, 18 and 20, and 22 years old, standing quietly in front of the wall, with an expression that is specific to people confronting history, that they know only as words and images, for the first time as a physical place. There is a delegation from the Vorath Dominion here today. There is every year. The delegation is always small, 4 or 5 people, and they always stand to one side, slightly apart from the main crowd, and they always bow their heads during the moment of silence. The current delegation is led by a young Vorath diplomat named Iris, who has been working in the Compact's Joint Oversight Office for 3 years, and who speaks passable English. Last year, she and I spoke briefly by the edge of the memorial, and she told me that the Kepler Compact Amendment is taught in Vorath schools, as the day the Dominion learned something permanent. I asked her what specifically. She said the word the curriculum used was consequence. I thought that was approximately right. The Vorath Dominion is smaller now, in terms of military capacity, and governed differently, with the external oversight required by the Compact Amendment in place and verifiable. The military restructuring was hard for them. Some elements of the old government resisted it for years, and there were 3 internal crises in the first 5 years that required compact monitoring forces to hold the line. But the structure held, and the oversight held, and the generation that grew up after it is different. Not transformed, not magically peaceful. Different in the way that people are different when they carry a genuine understanding of what their government did and what it cost. I am told that the phrase Kepler Protocol appears in War College curricula across 31 species now. It is the official strategic designation for the category of miscalculation the Vorath made, which is the belief that a patient and diplomatic species is a weak one, and that targeting civilians will produce compliance rather than resolve. The protocol describes what actually happens when you make that mistake, in terms of documented case studies and outcome analysis. The Keth Empire is case study 1. The Vorath Dominion is case study 2. The lecturers who teach it apparently conclude by noting that there are no case study 3s in progress, which they describe as encouraging. I think about Velkan sometimes, not with anger. He was a professional doing the work of a system that had given him the wrong model, and he tried, within that model, to think carefully and respond proportionately. He was wrong in ways that cost a great deal, but the wrongness was not personal. I read his report to Vorath High Command, the one where he recommended seeking immediate diplomatic channels. I read it years later, when the records were released as part of the compact judicial process. He had understood, by the end, what he had been missing. He wrote that human resilience under loss was a variable his models contained no mechanism to represent. He described it as a quality without strategic analog in any conflict he had previously studied. I found that observation honest, and I found it sad, and I found it important. He saw it. He just saw it too late. Fleet Admiral Drummond retired the year after the conflict ended. He lives in a coastal town in Wales now and grows vegetables and writes long letters to former colleagues that always begin with some observation about the weather. We exchange letters twice a year. He never discusses the conflict directly. He discusses other things: the vegetable garden, a book he has read, his grandchildren, his granddaughter Lily, who is now 19 and apparently still drawing horses. I read his letters carefully, because the things he does not say are as important as the things he does, and what he does not say, ever, is that he is at peace with it. I am not sure either of us is fully at peace with it. I am not sure that is the right goal. I think the right goal is something else, something more like carrying it, knowing it, not letting the weight of it collapse you, but not pretending the weight is not there either. Ben Holt commands his own vessel now. The Ironclad's successor, a larger ship with better systems, still named after the same principle. He sends me updates occasionally, short, factual messages about patrol assignments and personnel, and the occasional interesting compact development. At the end of every message, he adds a line about the crew. Not a report, just a note. Someone got promoted. Someone's spouse had a baby. Someone ran their first marathon on the recreation deck. He knows I like knowing. Owen Carr, my comms officer from that first night, left the military and went into compact diplomatic communications, which means he now manages the technical infrastructure for exactly the kind of conversations that should prevent another Kepler's rest. I think that is probably the best possible thing he could have done with what he experienced, and I told him so. He said he figured out pretty quickly that he wanted to spend his career making sure the alarm never goes off that way again. I cannot argue with that. I do not try. There are people in the Federation who think I should have used the authorization codes above Vorath Prime. They are not unreasonable people, and their argument is not an unreasonable one. They point to the 40,000 names on this wall, and they say that the Vorath should have faced the full weight of those names in the most complete possible sense. And I understand why they feel that. I felt it too. I felt it with the codes 3 inches from my hand, and every reason to reach for them. But I keep coming back to the same thought. The Vorath fired on Kepler's rest because they believed that they could demonstrate their power by destroying something that could not defend itself, and that this would change how we behaved. They believed that the application of overwhelming force against people who had done nothing was an acceptable tool of influence. If I had used those codes, I would have been doing that same thing. Bigger, more permanent. I would have taken 40,000 names on a wall and used them as my authorization. And I would have spent the rest of my life explaining the difference between what the Vorath did and what I did, and I do not think the explanation would have held. The rule, the oldest rule, is not just that you do not touch civilians. It is larger than that. It is that power has to know what it is for. It has to be able to stop. A force that cannot stop is not defending anything. It is only performing itself. I walk to the front of the memorial now, and I stand in front of the names, and I read. I read slowly. I have been coming here for 10 years, and I am perhaps a third of the way through. I will be coming for many more years. Behind me, I can hear the crowd gathered for the ceremony. I can hear the Vorath delegation standing quietly to the side. I can hear, somewhere out in the field, a group of the young cadets who made the journey here from the UEF training facility on New Perth, and one of them is asking another one a question in a low voice, and I catch one word of it. The word is why. I will answer that question when they come to ask me, as they always do. I will tell them what I told Vail Shan, which is the only answer I have that is completely honest. Because we can stop. Because we could have done the worst thing imaginable, and we chose not to. And that choice is not weakness, and it is not sentiment, and it is not strategic miscalculation. It is the thing that separates what we are from what the Vorath were in the moment they decided to glass a farming world to make a point. It is the difference between power and the discipline to hold it in your hands without being changed by holding it. The ceremony begins. I turn around and face the crowd. The sun is up now, fully, over the fields of Kepler's rest. The grass is green, the names are there, the rule holds. I believe it will keep holding, as long as there are enough people who understand why it matters, and are willing to pay the cost